Reading is the best way to expand vocabulary and learn about new things. But how should you approach reading in Chinese? And what are the best free reading resources out there? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about reading in Chinese. Today I published an article that contains the best free reading resources for beginner, intermediate and advanced learners, and this podcast is meant as a companion to that article. But since the article itself is mostly a list of 30, that would be 10 resources for each level, it doesn't make much sense to go through all of it here because I want to be able to update the article, and that would make this podcast obsolete very quickly. So instead, I will talk about reading in general, and I will talk about reading on specific levels. And since I plan to update the article, I would also appreciate greatly if I heard from you, if you have any specific reading resources, free reading resources, that you particularly like or would like to recommend, and I'd be happy to update the article. To see what resources I currently recommend, please go to hackingchinese.com/free reading resources. Okay, so let's get started talking about reading in Chinese. And most people who have tried this will have realized that it's quite difficult, and it's harder to read in Chinese than in most other languages, and that is of course mostly because of characters. However, the way most people go about reading in Chinese makes it a lot harder than it actually needs to be. So what I think is the most typical way of studying Chinese or reading Chinese is to use a textbook, and you go through a text and you spend quite a lot of time on each text. You have a fairly sizable vocabulary list, you have grammar exercises and so on. And the result of this is that you will spend many weeks in class going through maybe only one text. Now, naturally, it depends on how difficult the text is, but in most textbooks, every single sentence contains one or sometimes even more than one new word. And that means that progress will be necessarily slow because there are so many things that you don't understand and that you need help figuring out. So this would then be called intensive reading, and it's simply a way of reading where, well, a lot of effort is needed to comprehend what's going on and to learn from it. So if you just casually read through a textbook that is a bit above your level, you will probably not learn that much, unless you also invest a lot of time studying. But this is not the only approach to reading in Chinese. We can also do something called extensive reading, which is when we read and understand almost everything of what's going on. And when I say almost everything, I mean 97, 98, 99%. So the idea here is not that you reach comprehension by studying the text intensively and looking up lots of words and figuring out the grammar and so on. You simply choose texts, or if you're a teacher, you provide or write texts that the student can understand with the vocabulary that they have. That makes it pretty likely that they will be able to figure out what the few new words actually mean, and it also gives them a lot of opportunities to see how the language is used and gradually build up a feel for the language. And here there's a very big difference between, say, reading a text that is very difficult and spending, say, 10 hours reading it, and reading 10 texts in the same time. Those texts would then, of course, have to be 10 times easier, but then you would see these words over and over, you would see them in different contexts, and you would gradually be able to figure out how, say, grammar and word usage actually works in Chinese. Whereas if you spend all those hours on one single text, that tells you a lot less about how these words are used. You're only essentially given one example of each, and that is far from enough to figure out how the language works. So what I'm saying here is that you should try to read as much as possible on or below your current level. Naturally, you don't have to do that all the time, but do it as much as possible. If you want to know more about extensive reading in Chinese, episode 16 of this podcast was entirely about extensive reading, so go and check that out. Now, it's of course not that easy to find texts that are on or below your level, especially if you're a beginner or lower intermediate learner. But there are a few ways you can scaffold your learning, and scaffolding here refers to something that you use to be able to understand something at a higher level that would be difficult to understand without these tools. A few examples would be to use a pop-up dictionary, and that enables you to look up words without too much effort. And that can be very helpful because sometimes there is a word that would allow you to understand what something means, but it's maybe not a word you want to spend a lot of time on. Simply knowing what it means and then moving on might be enough, and the pop-up dictionary can give you that. Then we also have annotation of various types. So that could be, for example, extracting word lists or highlighting difficult words or even highlighting the meaning of certain words that is beyond your current level, or using colors in various ways, adding pinyin, and so on. We also have visualizations of various types. So the most obvious one would be if you say, read a comic or if you watch a movie, and here you then have pictures that go along with the text. And when you have the pictures and they match what's going on in the text, naturally understanding becomes easier because you can see what's going on as well. Now, if the text is not matched to the images might actually make it harder because you have more things to process, but usually in, for example, movies, they do of course match, so it helps a lot to be able to see what's going on as well. You can also listen, and that kind of assumes that your listening is better than your reading, of course, but there are many resources that have recorded audio, and many of the resources I share in the article also have recordings. Or you can use text-to-speech, which is getting increasingly better. Let's move on to talking about reading on different levels. So as a beginner, the obvious problem is that everything is very hard. And especially if you just started learning Chinese, everything will be new and every single character will be new, and so there is no such thing as extensive reading. However, the difficulty is still important because there are, of course, different kinds of difficult. If you read a book or a resource that uses, say, only the 150 most common characters, that is something that if you read it enough at a beginner level, you can start figuring out a lot of things, and you will also see the same characters over and over, and you stand a much better chance of learning something from that experience, compared to if you read, say, random novel, which might contain, say, 3,000 unique characters. If you did that, you would not see the same things over and over, and it would just be a complete waste of time, basically. So as a beginner, even though it's true that everything is hard, try to pick something that is the least hard. And that basically means that you have to stick to texts that are written specifically for beginners. I know there are many people who advocate using authentic language, i.e. language that is not specifically written for teaching the language, but as a beginner that is more or less impossible because even simple things in Chinese, such as signs and instructions or very basic things such as children's books, they are actually quite difficult in Chinese, and it's not something that you can just start reading. So as a beginner and even as an intermediate learner, your best bet is to stick mostly to texts written specifically for people on your level. And so this week's article is about free resources, not just resources in general for reading. And this matters because creating this type of resource is very difficult. And there are several requirements that have to be met at once. So first you have to write something that is at least moderately interesting, right? And then you have to control your language so you don't use difficult words. And then in addition to that, you also have to make it sound natural in Chinese. And this is really hard. For my course Unlocking Chinese, the ultimate guide for beginners, I wrote 150 sentences that taught 150 words in the lowest HSK level. And these are sentences where each sentence introduces one and exactly one new word, and where no sentence contains anything that hasn't been previously taught in an earlier sentence. And creating something like this is like a huge jigsaw puzzle where just moving one piece might ruin something somewhere else, and it's very difficult to do. And the reason I say this is that most of the really good reading resources for beginners actually aren't free. And in the article, like I said, I do share resources that are free. Today we're talking about free resources, and I did my very best to find those for you, so go check out the article if you're curious. Now, if you're an intermediate learner, things look a little bit brighter, but not as bright as you might think. And the reason for this is that while it's true that you can now read more texts, it is also true that there are more people who create learning materials for beginners, simply because there are more beginners out there and it makes more sense to target them. So you can often see people complain about this, that it's hard to find resources for intermediate learners, even though you can read more. And that is true, and I had to look a long time to find the resources that I did put in the article. And of course, most of the resources that work for beginners also work for intermediate learners. And this is partly because people who write beginner materials don't practice the strict control I was talking about when it comes to vocabulary, for example. So they will sneak in lots of words and expressions that actually aren't very suitable for beginners. But as an intermediate learner, that might be good for you, because then the general flow of the story or whatever text it is comprehensible, and then there will be a few words here and there that stick out and that are new to you, and you can learn those fairly easily. So don't forget that as an intermediate learner, reading things that are tagged as beginner materials might actually be very beneficial. Moving on to the advanced level, it should be fairly clear that you should try to read things where you understand almost everything when you read it the first time. Now, naturally, when you get to an advanced level, you can start reading basically anything. And that also means that your interests and your reasons for learning Chinese start mattering a lot more. If you are interested in something, it could definitely be worth tackling more difficult texts because of that. So let's say that your job requires you to understand something in Mandarin, or you have a hobby or an interest of some kind. Then starting to read materials in those areas, even though it wouldn't qualify as extensive reading, is perfectly fine, because you will find it interesting and you will spend the necessary time to get into those texts. And this is also reflected in the article, because of course I don't know what you're interested in, so rather picking the 10 best reading resources for advanced learners, which is kind of hard, I mainly try to select a few good resources for various types of resources. So for example, web novels or short stories, news, popular science, discussion forums, and so on. So you can get at least a little bit of inspiration what you can read. So that more or less wraps up this podcast episode. But like I said before, please head over to the article itself and check out the resources that I recommended. And these took dozens of hours to compile and describe, but even so, there are probably many good resources out there that I simply don't know about. So please let me know what you think, and if you have any better free reading resources for learning Chinese to recommend. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.